Welcome to this presentation on ISO 9001-2015 and IATF 16949-2016. This module is about the process approach, including risk-based thinking. My name is Paul Hardiman, Director of Quality Partner. I've been working with quality management systems for 25 years and I'm an IATF witness auditor and trainer. So let's have a look at what is risk, what is an opportunity, and what is risk-based thinking. So firstly, let's have a look at risk. In ISO 9001-2015, the definition of risk is the effect of uncertainty. If we look at ISO 31000, which is a standard about risk management, the definition there is the effect of uncertainty of objectives. In here, they note that the effect may be positive, it may be negative, or it may be a deviation from the expected. Also, risk is often described by an event, a change in circumstances, or a consequence. So whereas risk is often thought about in the negative context, ISO also talk about opportunity. Opportunity is talked about in 6.1.2, Note 2 of ISO 9001-2015. What this note says is opportunities can lead to the adoption of new practices, launching new products, opening new markets, addressing new clients, building partnerships, using new technology or other desirable or viable possibilities to address the organization or its customer needs. So when we go into this, we need to think about risk, but we also need to think about identifying opportunities. So firstly, let's have a look at ISO 9001. In ISO 9001-2008, there was one reference to the word risk in the introduction. Risk was inferred within the standard, for example, within the requirement for preventive action. In ISO 9001-2015, we saw a fundamental change. Within the introduction section, we see that there are 16 references to the word risk. Within the auditable requirements, we see that there are 8 auditable requirements that specifically mention risk and opportunity. So this is one of the fundamental changes that we need to understand. So now let's take a look within automotive quality management systems. Within ISO TS 16949-2009, the word risk was actually mentioned within the requirement for feasibility review. But also risk was inferred in other requirements. For example, one of the fundamental core tools within automotive quality management systems is FMEA. And obviously, FMEA is looking at risk. And also within contingency planning. Within ISO TS 16949-2009, we did see detailed requirements about developing a contingency plan that should be managing the risks to make sure that we can supply the customer on time, in full, with the products they require. So, what's in IATF 16949-2016? The word count shows that the word risk is used 59 times within the total document, but 51 times the word risk is used within the requirements. So here you can see that there is an obvious change in emphasis. Building on the requirements in ISO 9001 related to risk, and IATF believe that risk-based thinking and looking at risk and opportunity is one of the fundamental changes within the standard that we need to understand. So let's think about a risk management process. Now, I stressed from the beginning that there is no requirement to have a documented process related to risk management. Although personally, I think that would be a good idea to drive standardization in the way that risk is looked at through the organization. So first thing, the top management within the organization need to define the organization's strategic direction, and they need to define their strategic objectives that the organization is trying to achieve to meet both the organization, the customer and interested party requirements. Now, in achieving those objectives, there will be risks. So within our risk management process, we need to think about how we're going to identify the risks and how we're going to assess the size of those risks. We then need to think within our risk management process about risk reporting and making a decision about what we're going to do about the risks. We then need to define the actions that we're going to take to either mitigate, reduce, or manage the risks. And we need to check that this risk management process is working through our internal audit system and by monitoring performance through our management review. But I stress again that this is only an example of an outline risk management process. Many of you, particularly those large corporate organisations watching this presentation, will already have a process in place for risk management. But the one thing that you need to ensure is that this risk management process is included within the scope of the quality management system. So if we think about a process, and if we're trying to assess the risks and opportunities within the process, we need to make sure we've got clearly defined scope of the activities of the process, and we've got clearly defined boundaries. So when we think about the scope and the boundaries of a process, we need to think about the strategic aspects of the process, the environment in which the organisation operates, but we also need to think about the organisational context. For example, the objectives of the process, the core activities within the process, the product and the customer base as an example. But before we run away and start thinking about risk, please make sure that we understand the scope and the boundaries, because if we don't, it will make identifying risk and opportunities difficult. So now let's take a look at risk identification techniques. So if we go into the internet, you will see many different techniques that we can use to identify risk. In this slide, I just list a few. Brainstorming is one way we can identify risk and opportunity. Sending out questionnaires both within the organisation and maybe to interested parties is another way. We can use industry benchmark data that talks about our risk and our opportunities. We can play out scenarios. What if, for example, this happened? We can do formal risk assessment workshops. We can use auditing and inspection to identify risk. This is often the way that we would identify safety risks within the organisation. Obviously, a fundamental requirement of automotive quality management systems is failure mode and effect analysis. That's not going to disappear, so we can still use FMEA to identify risk and opportunity for improvement within the organisation. Many of you watching this presentation will already be familiar with turtle diagrams. One of the fundamental reasons turtle diagrams were promoted by IATF is they make an organisation think about process risk. We can use techniques like fault tree analysis. We can use and have to use contingency planning as part of our automotive quality management system. And when we take on board or potentially take on board new business, we can also think about risk and opportunity through doing effective feasibility review. So this lists a few of the possible techniques that we can use to identify risk. ISO 9001-2015 and IATF 16949-2016 does not prescribe which technique that we have to use. So let's just do a quick refresher on what I've called here the traditional turtle diagram. If we're doing a turtle diagram, we have to understand clearly what is the thing that drives the process, what is the input into the process, what is the process itself, what is the context and the scope of the process, and also what are the required outputs of the process to meet the internal or the external customer or interested party requirements. So the first thing is clearly defining the input and output of the process. The next thing that we need to understand is what results the process is trying to achieve. This could include objectives for both effectiveness and efficiency. So in understanding what results we're trying to achieve, we can then work our way round the turtle diagram. So the with who part of the turtle diagram thinks about the people that are involved in the process. How do we define, for example, the people responsibilities and authorities working within the process? How do we make sure that people have got the right skills and that those skills are updated with changing things that go on within the process? If we don't manage that effectively, it can affect achieving the desired results. Then we need to think about the with what. So these are the physical things that the process needs to operate effectively. So for example, it could be raw materials, it could be equipment, it could be computers, it could be tables and chairs. It's things that we physically need for the process to operate effectively. Then we need to understand the how. So this is the quality management system documentation that is needed. So the documented information, the processes, the procedures, the standardized work, the work instructions that we need to have in place to make sure that the process is effectively operated and monitored to achieve the desired results. And finally, support processes. No process can operate in isolation. It needs support from other processes. So this prompts discussion on, are those other processes providing the required level of support to the process that we're analysing? So this is what is known as a turtle diagram. So whereas we've just taken a look at what I've called the traditional turtle diagram, now let's take a look at a modified turtle diagram. So when I first saw the draft of ISO 9001-2015, my brain said, how can we use the turtle concept to drive risk-based thinking? So that's really what this modified turtle diagram tries to do. It's expanding the traditional turtle diagram to think about risk, i.e. what could go wrong against any of the things that we've identified within the traditional turtle diagram. It's going to get us to think about the ranking of those risks, and again there is no ISO or IATF requirement for how we go about ranking risk, and then control and opportunity. For some of the risks we'll also have existing controls in place, but for some of the risks we won't have controls, and that then throws up an opportunity. So this is an idea where we can maybe take our existing turtle diagrams, if we have them, and expand them to more think about risk-based thinking. So I've mentioned within the discussion so far, there is no ISO or IATF requirement for how we go about assessing or ranking risk. Obviously for FMEA, we have to make sure that we're using customer specified ranking systems. But what about risk in all the other processes within the quality management system that we need to understand? Now within ISO 31000, risk assessment is defined as the overall process of risk analysis and risk evaluation. So what I show on the screen now is one possible method that we could use to evaluate the risks that we've identified by an extended version of the turtle diagram or by any other risk identification technique. Many of you will already be familiar with this model based upon probability and severity or impact. For example, some of you will already use this methodology for identifying health and safety based risks. So this risk assessment system works on a scale of probability, typically of 1 to 5, where we look at the probability of an event occurring. And this can extend from a very low probability to a very high probability. Then we can think about the severity or the impact of that event actually occurring. So if it does occur, what type of impact would it have? Would it have a very small or minor impact? Or could, if it did happen, it threaten the overall success of the organisation? So if we use this model and we score each risk using this model, we would end up with a score of 1 to 25. And typically we would then break it down into red risks, the areas of highest risk, the yellow risk, an area of intermediate risks, and green risk, which are risks that we may decide as an organisation that we're happy to live with. But I do stress again that this is only one example that we could use for quantifying risk. You can use any model you want, but my advice would be to not make it too complicated. If you try and use the FMEA risk ranking system for assessing all risk, I think it would be too complicated. But that is just my personal point of view. You've got to try and develop a risk ranking system that works for your own organisation. So what you can see on the screen now then is an example of a modified turtle diagram. And I picked the example of the contingency planning process because I've mentioned that this is one of the requirements that has quite significantly changed in IATF 16949/2016. Within this modified turtle diagram, we think about what is needed within the contingency planning process. So what people are involved in contingency planning, with what is needed physically within contingency planning, how do we manage the contingency planning process, and what support is needed to achieve the intended results. Within this example, I show that there are some very high risks that we've identified. What we need to make sure, particularly against those high risks, is we are taking effective action to mitigate those risks. Maybe when we've identified controls and improvements against the red risks, we could then move on to the yellow risk, and ultimately we could even work to reduce the risk against those that are identified as green. So this is one possible way that we can drive risk-based thinking down to each of the process owners within the organisation. If each process owner took it upon themselves with a team of people that are involved in the process to develop one of these modified turtle diagrams, to go through a process of identifying and ranking the risk, deciding what controls are already in place and questioning are those controls effective, what opportunities there are to improve the process to make sure that the relevant process that we're understanding is capable of meeting the achieved results. Once we've done that, I think it goes a long way to promoting risk-based thinking throughout the organisation, which is one of the IATF 16949 requirements and is building upon the requirements in ISO 9001-2015. So let's think then about addressing risk. Within 6.1.2 in ISO 9001-2015, Note 1 gives several different options about what an organisation can do to address risk. The first thing is let's just avoid the risk. Now obviously that's not applicable in all cases, but for example, if we get an inquiry from a new customer and through feasibility review we believe that is too high a risk, we could write back to the customer and say, I'm very sorry, I'm not going to quote you for the new business. So one opportunity is to avoid the risk. The second is to take risk in order to pursue an opportunity. So this is where management within the organisation will decide maybe in taking on board new business there is a risk, but the opportunity far outweighs the risk. So we might decide to go ahead. The third one is looking at the possibility, can we eliminate the source of the risk? The fourth one is maybe we can't eliminate the risk source, but maybe we can change the likelihood of the consequence related to the risk. The next one, sharing the risk. I'm sure those of you that are watching from the automotive industry will know these days there is a lot of outsourcing. And outsourcing is again one possible way that we can share the risk. Consignment stock may be another way that we can share the risk. So that may be one of the ways that we can address risk by sharing it. The final one, and this again will not apply in all cases, is we may decide to retain the risk by making an informed decision. Just like FMEA, we might decide based upon the risk priority number or the severity times occurrence that we've identified, that as a business we are happy to retain and manage that risk and control it by management of the 4M condition. So this is what ISO says about how we can go about addressing the risks that we identified. Thomas Jefferson said, with great risk comes great reward. So we don't need to just go into this thinking about the negative aspect of risk, but let's think about the opportunities that can come out of going through this process. And now finally then, we need to think, once we've identified risk and opportunities, that this is not going to stay still. Things within an organisation will change. So risk-based thinking needs to be an ongoing process. For example, as an organisation we may take on board new business, we may decide to move into new markets, we may launch new products, we may bring in new processes, etc., etc. So we need to promote, and top management need to promote within the organisation, down through the process owners, that periodically we need to go back and think about risk and opportunity. And if we have used the modified version of the turtle diagram, we periodically need to go back to those turtle diagrams to look at the results that we've achieved. We need to look at what's changed within the process, and we need to update the risk and opportunities in line with what we've found. So let's just try and summarise what we've tried to cover within this presentation. So firstly, risk-based thinking is the biggest change in ISO 9001-2015 and in IATF 16949-2016. This is not going to go away. It's a fundamental part of both standards. But to be in business, you must already be managing risks in your everyday working life. You as top management within the organisation, the process owners within organisations, and people working on the shop floor. Every day they are managing risk. But now what top management and process owners and employees need to show is documented information that the risks and opportunities within the processes have been identified, and they're being controlled to make sure that the processes achieve their defined objectives. In this presentation we've had a look at an example of a modified turtle approach, but also I showed you a list of other possible risk identification techniques. In looking at making a successful transition to ISO 9001-2015 and IATF 16949-2016, this is a fundamental decision that the top management within the organisation need to make. What are we going to use to identify risk and opportunity? Are we going to let each process owner go away and identify their own methodology, or are we going to prescribe a standardised methodology? This is something that is a fundamental part of making a successful transition. Thank you for listening to this presentation. We will go into risk-based thinking in far more detail in videos on each of the individual processes within a typical automotive quality management system.